Okay friends, it's time to get started on our job. One of the first things you want to do is safely raise and support the front of the vehicle so the wheel's off the ground. After that, remove all 5 of your 19mm lug nuts and then the wheel. Now that the wheel's off, the next thing that I always do is come right to the axle nut. We're going to use a 34mm socket to go ahead and remove that. Now let's go with a hammer and a punch. Right in the center here, we're going to break the axle free from the wheel bearing. Once you've got movement from that, let's move along to our ball joint. Looking inside this area right here, you can see that ball joint nut. Now typically this is going to be some sort of a castle nut that has slots on it, and that slot will have a cotter pin going through it, which essentially locks it in. So we just need to get the cotter pin out and remove this nut. Once you have the cotter pin out of there, go ahead and use an 18mm wrench to remove your nut. Now we're going to have to go ahead and separate that ball joint from the knuckle. I'm going to use a pickle fork and my hammer. Carefully get in between this area and separate the two, being very careful not to damage my brakes or anything along the way. Now that that's separated, we can move along to cutting off the heads of our rivets that hold the ball joint to the lower control arm. To do this, I'm going to use my cutoff wheel, essentially cut off the head so it's nice and flush. We'll do the same to all of these, and then we can go ahead and separate the ball joint from the control arm. The next thing that we're going to do is just take a bar and get right inside this area of the control arm. Gently pry down, and we're going to separate the ball joint from the knuckle. Once that's separated, just go ahead and pull it right to the side. Let's get this separated. Now we're just going to be very careful not to damage the axle boot in any way. Okay, there it is, friends. Here's the reason why we're having such a hard time. It has these metal areas that go straight down through the aluminum control arm. Now the next thing you want to do is just clean and inspect those holes. Make sure there's no dirt or debris or damage in any areas. Now it's time to install our ball joint. Let's get this lined up with the corresponding holes. We can take our brand new bolts, start sliding those through as well. Now we're just going to go ahead and put through all the bolts. On them, if you wanted to, you could use some red thread locker. We'll call it your prerogative. The nuts are locking nuts. Let's go ahead and start each of the nuts on here. Now let's torque each of these to 65 foot-pounds. All right, so let's get ready to start putting all this back together. We're going to make sure that the axle is going into the back side of the bearing. Just go ahead and line that up real quick. Now we can pull down on the control arm and we can start lining everything up along the way. Now let's go ahead and put our bar back inside that control arm so we can carefully start pulling down on this. At the same time as I'm pulling down, I also need to line up the axle with the back side of the bearing and line up the ball joint with the lower aspect of the knuckle. Now once you have that started in there, just double check to make sure the axle isn't going to bind. And then the next thing I'm going to do is just go ahead and rock everything until it settles in. Go ahead and put on that castle nut. This nut right here is supposed to have a torque of 35 foot-pounds. As you can tell, there's minimal room in this area to be able to put on a torque wrench. Go ahead and make sure it's tight. At that point, I feel as though I've got it nice and tight. I'm not worried about the stud spinning inside the knuckle. So the next thing you want to do is just make sure that your cotter pin hole is lined up with the stud of the ball joint and a slot. If it isn't, just continue tightening until the very next one does. Go ahead and lock it in with that cotter pin. Now once you have that pulled through, go ahead and lock it down by peening it over so there's no way it can break free on its own. Now it's a good idea to use some red thread locker on the threads of your axle. We'll go ahead and start that nut on there. Now for this, we're going to go ahead and bottom this nut out by hand. We'll go ahead and get the wheel on here. Once it's on the ground, you'll be able to torque this a lot easier. Let's go ahead and get this lug nut out of the way, grab our wheel, get ready to put that on. Now let's go ahead and start on all 5 of our lug nuts. We'll bottom them out, get the wheel back on the ground, and then we'll torque each of them to 100 foot-pounds. Let's torque those lug nuts. Now we can go ahead and torque that axle nut to 118 foot-pounds.